Chapter 17 Single Pilot Resource Management, Aeronautical Decision-Making, and Risk Management Introduction. The accident rate for helicopters has traditionally been higher than the accident rate for airplanes, probably due to the helicopter's unique abilities to fly and land in more diverse situations than airplanes. With no significant improvement in helicopter accident rates for the last 20 years, the Helicopter Association International, HAI, set the goal of an 80% reduction in helicopter accidents by the year 2016. The Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, has joined HAI and other members of the helicopter community in accepting the challenge of improving the safety of helicopter operations. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB statistics, approximately 80% of all aviation accidents are caused by pilot error or the human factor. Figure 17.1. Many of these accidents are the result of the tendency of instructors to focus flight training on teaching the student pilot the physical aspects of flying the aircraft and only enough aeronautical knowledge to pass the written and practical tests. Today's instructor must incorporate aeronautical decision-making, ADM, into flight training. ADM includes single pilot resource management, SRM, risk management, situational awareness, task management, and controlled flight into terrain, CFIT, awareness. Ignoring these safety issues can have fatal results. The flight instructor who integrates SRM into flight training teaches aspiring pilots how to be more aware of potential risks in flying, how to clearly identify those risks, and how to manage them successfully. An instructor's first priority should be the student. Too often instructors rush through academics, flight planning, and pre-flight to get into the helicopter and begin logging time. This is a very dangerous first impression for the student. Instructors learn the law of primacy, yet so often this is the first principle violated. The first flight should be preceded by very thorough pre-flight planning, encompassing every facet of aeronautical decision-making. While we do not want to overwhelm the student, it is very important to instill a sense of methodical decision-making, ensuring the student understands that safety should never take a back seat to getting off the ground. What will be the first impression of a student who has rushed through pre-flight planning for the purpose of getting off the ground? If not shown the proper procedure from the very first flight, students most likely accomplish only what they remember and what was first learned. To go backward to earlier steps that were not discussed or conducted improperly leads to confusion or rules misinterpreted by the student. We often hear a student state, "We didn't check whether last flight or do performance planning, but today the instructor says it looks marginal." In other words, the student is thinking, "I guess we just check the weather if it looks bad." This could be the first link in the accident chain, and a prime example of poor decision-making as a result of poor instructional practices. The helicopter instructor should include the student in all flight decisions made during the course of instruction. By discussing the mental processes used to determine whether or not to fly, the student learns SRM, crew resource management, and human factors from the beginning of training. It is important for the instructor to model a high standard of professionalism which provides the student with a good role model and helps develop safe flying habits from the start of training. During dual instruction, the instructor should practice good crew resource management, CRM. As the student approaches solo proficiency, the instructor should begin discussing what actions and resources the student will have available during solo flights. Good pre-flight briefings review past performances, provide suggestions for improvement, and define the flight lessons to be demonstrated and performed during this training period. Performance of any new maneuvers should be understood by the student prior to leaving the briefing room. An effective instructor of ADM guides the student through the decision process by posing a question or situation that engages the student pilot in some form of decision-making activity. Examining the decisions made. Exploring other ways to solve the problem. Evaluating which way is best. For example, if the student is going to practice simulated engine failures, prior to flying and then during the debrief, the instructor might ask questions such as, "Where are you going to land? Why did you pick that place to land? Is there a better choice? Which place is the safest? Or why?" These questions force the student to focus on the decision process. This accelerates the acquisition of improved judgment, which is simply the decision-making process resulting from experience. By introducing decision-making opportunities into routine training lessons, instructors speed up acquisition of experience, thus enhancing judgment. Origins of ADM and SRM. For over 25 years, the importance of good pilot judgment, or ADM, has been recognized as critical to the safe operation of aircraft, as well as accident avoidance. Motivated by the need to reduce accidents caused by human factors, the airline industry developed the first training programs based on improving Admiral called Crew Resource Management, CRM. These programs focused on training flight crews on the effective use of all available resources, human resources, hardware, and information supporting ADM to facilitate crew operation and improve decision-making. The effectiveness of this training prompted the FAA to incorporate these concepts into training directed at improving the decision-making of pilots. It also led to current FAA regulations that require decision-making be taught as part of pilot training curriculum. The effectiveness of ADM training has been validated in independent studies in which student pilots received ADM training in conjunction with the standard flying curriculum. When tested, the pilots who received ADM training made fewer in-flight errors than those who had not. Contrary to popular opinion, good judgment can be taught. Building upon the foundation of conventional decision-making, ADM enhances the process to decrease the probability of human error and increase the probability of a safe flight. Many of the concepts utilized in CRM have been successfully applied to single pilot operations, which led to the development of SRM. Defined as the art and science of managing all the resources, both on board the aircraft and from outside resources, available to a single pilot, prior to and during flight, SRM ensures the successful outcome of the flight. As mentioned earlier, this includes ADM, risk management, situational awareness, SA, task management, and fit awareness. SRM is about helping pilots learn how to gather information, analyze it, and make decisions. It helps the pilot assess and manage risk accurately and make accurate and timely decisions. For instance, give the new student tasks such as checking weather, determining weather sources and their content, and conduct performance planning for current and forecast conditions. Having the student perform these vital tasks is likely to instill confidence and, when reviewed by the instructor, provide a solid ADM foundation. Help the student identify hazards, report them, and explain why and under which circumstances they are applicable. After training, the student may not report them to anyone, but rather acknowledge their existence and make seasoned, rational risk management decisions concerning those hazards. This is the essence of risk management. A pilot should acknowledge hazards, determine risk factors, and develop risk mitigation plans. For example, a pilot notices a large rock has surfaced in the hover training area. The pilot should recognize the rock could cause a dynamic rollover accident. In this case, the pilot should report the rock to the airport authority and avoid the area until the rock is removed and the hole filled. The pilot should also remember the rock can be a hazard during mowing seasons. During mowing, pieces of the rock can be ejected from the mower like small missiles, damaging thin helicopter parts. In effect, you lead the student through the risk management process, which is much easier to comprehend at the planning table than in the air. At some point in the training, the instructor should begin to ask the student to evaluate situations, and determine if hazards are present and what results risk management analysis would yield. For aeronautical decision-making skills to be gained and developed, conclusions must be made and results determined. That is called experience. The decision-making process. The instructor needs to understand the basic concepts of the decision-making process in order to provide the student with a foundation for developing ADM skills. It is important to teach students how to respond to emergency situations, such as an engine failure, which requires an immediate response using established procedures with little time for detailed analysis. This type of decision-making is called automatic decision-making and is based upon training, experience, and recognition. Traditional instruction trains students to react to emergencies, but does not prepare the student to make decisions requiring a more reflective response through greater analysis. There is usually time during a flight to examine any changes that occur, gather information, and assess risk before reaching a decision. The steps leading to this conclusion constitute the decision-making process. In many cases, decision-making is the filtering of options and accurate perception of the true conditions. For example, if the weather is at all questionable, cancel the flight and explain to the student that their lives are worth much more than getting training done in questionable weather and possibly risking an accident due to the conditions. Instructors can demonstrate decision-making skills through emergency training, required maneuvers, or table discussion. Too often instructors check the block, that is, they have the student perform a series of tasks without ever seeing the student exercise problem-solving skills. Have you ever participated in an academic evaluation with an evaluator asking, what is the emergency procedure for an engine failure, for a hydraulic failure, for a high engine oil temp indication, and so on? What is being evaluated? The answer is simple: the student's ability to memorize emergency procedures and limitations. Provide system or mechanical indicators as part of a flight profile scenario that can be associated with a specific emergency or maneuver that is likely to be encountered. One example is teaching students to abort takeoffs. Although quick stops are taught as to how to stop, aborted takeoffs are rarely practiced with the judgment factor exercised. Instructors can evaluate or train this maneuver while evaluating the student's decision-making process. Instructors should challenge and evaluate the student's decision-making abilities. The intent is not to trick the student or demonstrate your superior knowledge, but rather to increase student ability to gather information, assess a situation, determine options, and choose a course of action. Defining the problem. The first step in the decision-making process is to define the problem, which begins with recognizing that a change has occurred or that an expected change did not occur. A problem is perceived first by the senses, then is distinguished through insight and experience. One critical error that can be made during the decision-making process is incorrectly defining the problem. Teach students to establish scanning or cross-checks. Do not allow an unusual finding to become a flight distraction, but do not ignore what may be an abnormal condition. For example, a rapidly falling engine tachometer reading could indicate the engine has failed, and an auto rotation needs to be entered immediately. It could mean the engine tachometer has failed. The actions to be taken in each of these circumstances would be significantly different. One requires an immediate decision based upon training, experience, and evaluation of the situation. The latter decision is based upon an analysis. It should be noted that the same indication could result in two different actions depending upon other influences. Given this set of circumstances, we should immediately cross-check other instruments to verify our tachometer reading. By teaching our students to gather, identify, and assess the information quickly, we expect them to make the appropriate decision. In this case, if the engine RPM indication is decaying, but the rotor RPM is within the normal range, then the problem is the gauge. If the rotor RPM is decaying, then it is a power problem. Gathering all available information in a timely manner is a very important factor in defining the problem. In the first instance, if the engine failed, then the proper action would be to auto-rotate. On the other hand, if the rapidly falling engine tachometer reading was due to a failure of the engine tachometer, then the engine is still running. The helicopter is under power, and a landing under power could be accomplished. Choosing a course of action after the problem has been identified, the student must evaluate the need to react to it and determine the actions that may be taken to resolve the situation in the time available. The expected outcome of each possible action should be considered and the risks assessed before selecting a response to the situation. Implementing the decision and evaluating the outcome. Although a decision may be reached and a course of action implemented, the decision-making process is not complete. The decision-making process continues, eliminating some options and recognizing new options as conditions change. It is important that the instructor teach the student how to think ahead and determine how the decision could affect other phases of flight. As the flight progresses, encourage the student to continue to evaluate the outcome of the decision to ensure it is producing the desired result. Improper decision-making outcomes. Pilots sometimes get in trouble not because of deficient basic skills or system knowledge, but because of faulty decision-making skills. One realistic scenario involves a fuel gauge suddenly indicating near zero or empty. Should the pilot land and visually check the fuel tanks in the next safe area to land, or continue as planned and just consider it a gauge malfunction? The instructor should be teaching the pilot to evaluate the risk in landing to check the fuel state visually, instead of continuing the flight uninterrupted and just hoping that it is only the gauge system failing. What could be the consequences if the gauge were correct versus being failed? Although aeronautical decisions may appear to be simple or routine, each individual decision in aviation often defines the options available for the next decision the pilot must make and the options, good or bad, they provide. Therefore, it is important for the instructor to stress to the student that a poor decision early in a flight can compromise the safety of the flight at a later time. Emphasize the importance of making accurate decisions. Good decision-making early in an emergency provides greater latitude for options later on. FAA resources. FAA resources offer the instructor a variety of structured frameworks for decision-making that provide assistance in organizing the decision process. These models include but are not limited to the 3P of 5P IUTA, and the DECIDE models. All these models and their variations are discussed in detail in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge chapter on Aeronautical Decision-Making. Figure 17.2, whatever model is used, the instructor wants to ensure the student learns how to define a problem, recognize all feasible options available, choose a course of action, implement the decision, and evaluate the outcome, continuing the process if necessary. Remember, there is no one right answer in this process. Each student is expected to analyze the situation in light of experience level, personal minimums, and current physical and mental readiness level, and make his or her own decision. Human factors. Curiosity, healthy or harmful? Curiosity is another human trait that kills. Airmen should be taught to control their curiosity until they land unless they wish to be test pilots and perform the standard risk management operations prior to the test flight. Children tend to reply, "I don't know," when asked why they did something foolish because they really do not know that they succumb to a burning curiosity about what would happen if they took the action. Humans are born curious and are always looking to see what is over the next hill or wave. That innate drive can make us bored or unhappy with what we have because we do not know what is over there. Whether it is a new country, planet, or just a different recipe for a new taste, we are curious explorers. Restrained curiosity can be healthy. Spontaneous excursions in aviation can be deadly. An airman musing "let's see how this works" should not tinker with the object of curiosity while in the air. Airmen should abide by established procedures until proper hazard assessment and risk management are complete. Pilot curiosity crashes modern aircraft just as it did early aircraft. A pilot may wonder how much he or she can fly or haul in one day. That curiosity leads to a personal challenge that may in turn lead to overloading the machine. The pilot may think of a method to improve production, but may neglect to factor in the design criteria for the machine, leading to unsafe overloads or fatigue. A pilot may decide not to act upon curiosity about something only after learning that another pilot's action stemming from the same curiosity ended in tragedy. Instructors must be aware of not only their own curiosity but also the attitude and tendencies of their students. The tone of a student's question can often be interpreted. For instance, one student may ask, "Is the maximum weight limit of this aircraft due to design or power limits?" This is a question that promotes further discussion or correlation of the limiting factors. Another student may ask, "You can exceed the maximum weight limit if you really need to, can't you?" This student wants to push the envelope, and his or her curiosity may not be of a healthy nature. If left unchecked, curiosity can kill the pilot. Risk management is a formalized way of dealing with hazards. It is the logical process of weighing the potential costs of risks against the possible benefits of allowing those risks to stand uncontrolled. It is a decision-making process designed to help the pilot identify hazards systematically, assess the degree of risk, and determine the best course of action. Once risks are identified, they must be assessed. The risk assessment determines the degree of risk, negligible, low, medium, or high, and whether the degree of risk is worth the outcome of the planned activity. If the degree of risk is acceptable, the planned activity may then be undertaken. Once the planned activity is started, consideration must then be given whether to continue. Pilots must have pre-planned, viable alternatives available in the event the original flight cannot be accomplished as planned. Instructors play a critical role in developing the decision-making skills of new pilots. Observe various levels of and rates at which students acquire these skills. Some students seem very aware of their surroundings, and others focus solely on the task at hand. Additionally, all new pilots lack the experience base to identify potential hazards, such as a buzz in the pedals, or the options available to them. Instructors must share their knowledge and discuss options available to the student pilot. Hazard and risk mitigation are key terms in risk management. Define those terms for the student. Hazard, present condition, event, object, or circumstance that could lead to or contribute to an unplanned or undesired event like an accident. It is a source of danger. For example, binding in the anti-torque pedals represents a hazard. Risk, the future impact of a hazard that is not controlled or eliminated. It is the possibility of loss or injury. The level of risk is measured by the number of people or resources affected, exposure, the extent of possible loss, severity, and likelihood of loss, probability. Mitigation, the effort to reduce loss of life and property by lessening the impact of disasters through proper planning and developing and implementing procedures. A hazard can be a real or perceived condition, event, or circumstance that a pilot encounters. Teaching the student how to identify hazards, assess the degree of risk they pose, and determine the best course of action form an important element of today's flight training programs. For more information on risk management, refer the student to the Risk Management Handbook, FAA-H-8083-4. Assessing risk. It is important for the flight instructor to teach the student how to assess risk. Before the student can begin to assess risk, he or she must first perceive the hazard and attend it. Risks. Experience, training, and education help a pilot learn how to spot hazards quickly and accurately. Valuable information for instructors can be found on the NTSB website, http://www.ntsb.gov/aviation/aviation. HTM. Researching an accident and discussing the events that preceded it provide a real opportunity for an instructor to impart knowledge and insight to the new student pilot. Many accidents are due to the failure of the pilot to properly and/or quickly assess the risk of a hazard. Additionally, applying the applicable circumstances that led up to the accident will aid in building the new pilot's knowledge base. Associating the events and circumstances that led to an accident helps to build the new pilot's knowledge base. Once a hazard is identified, determining the probability and severity of an accident, level of risk associated with it, becomes the next step. For example, the hazard of binding in the anti-torque pedals poses a risk only if the helicopter is flown. If the binding leads to a loss of directional control, there is a high risk it could cause catastrophic damage to the helicopter and the passengers. The instructor helps the student identify hazards and how to deal with them by incorporating risk assessment into the training program. Every flight has hazards and some level of risk associated with those hazards. It is critical that students are able to differentiate in advance between a low-risk flight and a high-risk flight. Establish a review process and develop risk mitigation strategies to address flights throughout the low to high risk range. Determine low risk versus high risk by being educated on the primary causes, reactions, and final outcomes of failures caused by weather and aerodynamics. Using the 3P to form good safety habits as is true for other flying skills, risk management thinking habits are best developed through repetition and consistent adherence to specific procedures. The 3P model, while similar to other methods, offers 3 good reasons for its use. 1. It is fairly simple to teach and remember. 2. It gives students a structured, efficient, and systematic way to identify hazards, assess risk, and implement effective risk controls. 3. Practicing risk management needs to be as automatic as basic aircraft control. Figure 17.3, to assist the student pilot in using the 3P process, develop scenarios that use the building block theory. Introduce a simple circumstance that requires the student to progress through the perceive, process, and perform functions. For instance, during a hover power check the predicted value is exceeded. Have the student first go through the steps determining a course of action, then follow that course of action with continuous reassessment. Further examples can be made more complicated to augment the student's decision-making ability. Stressors affecting decision-making. Many factors, or stressors, can increase a pilot's risk of making a poor decision that affects the safety of the flight. Stressors are generally divided into 3 categories: environmental, physiological, and psychological. Figure 17.4, reduction of identifiable stressors can be seen in the simplification of instrumentation, clear procedures, and redundant systems. By making aviation as simple and predictable as possible, its stressfulness is reduced. ADM attempts to prevent the effects of stress and increase flight safety. Discuss stressors with the student and how stressors affect flight decision-making. Pilot self-assessment. Review the IMSAFE checklist with the student. Stress its importance as one of the best ways single pilots can mitigate risk by determining physical and mental readiness for flying. Figure 17.5, the PAVE checklist. Explain to the student that mitigation of risk begins with perceiving hazards. By incorporating the PAVE checklist into pre-flight planning, the instructor teaches the student how to divide the risks of flight into 4 categories: pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures, PAVE. Discuss with the student how these categories form part of a pilot's decision-making process. Figure 17.2, the PAVE checklist provides the student with a simple way to remember each category to examine for risk prior to each flight. Once the student identifies the risks of a flight, he or she needs to decide whether the risk or combination of risks can be managed safely and successfully. Stress to the student that the PIC is responsible for making the decision of whether or not to cancel the flight. Explain that if the pilot decides to continue with the flight, he or she should develop strategies to mitigate the risks. Encourage the student to learn how to control the risks by setting personal minimums for items in each risk category. Emphasize that these are limits unique to that individual pilot's current level of experience and proficiency, and should be re-evaluated periodically based upon experience and proficiency. Incorporate ongoing discussions of hazards, risk assessment, and risk mitigation into training to reinforce the student's decision-making skills. Recognizing hazardous attitudes. As discussed in the Aviation Instructor's Handbook, it is not necessary for a flight instructor to be a certified psychologist, but it is helpful to be aware of student behavior before and during each flight. If the instructor notices a hazardous attitude, which contributes to poor pilot judgment, he or she can counteract it effectively by converting that hazardous attitude into a positive attitude. Since recognizing a hazardous attitude is the first step toward neutralizing it, it is important for the student to learn the hazardous attitudes and the corresponding antidotes. The antidote for each of the hazardous attitudes should be memorized so it automatically comes to mind when needed. Figure 17.6, when reading Figure 17.6, keep in mind that each hazardous attitude relates directly to a potential incident or accident. So many of the regulations we abide by are in response to an increase of the aviation accident rate. Therefore, discuss specifics with the student that correlate to each. The anti-authority hazardous attitude explains numerous accidents involving weather-related decisions. We have ceiling and visibility minimums not just for you, but to allow other pilots to see and avoid you. Or, that old adage, I don't need my landing light on at night, I can see the lit runway. Just fine. Turn the landing lights on at night so other pilots can see you. Each hazardous attitude has an explanation and an antidote as seen in the figure. Stress management. Stress is the body's response to physical and psychological demands placed upon it. While a certain level of stress is necessary to perform optimally, too little stress can have as much of an adverse effect as too much stress. If the student is under too little stress, the thinking processes tend to wander to non-related thoughts and activities. For instance, the sterile cockpit rule, 14 CFR Part 121, Section 121.542, resulted from numerous accidents where the crew seemed to exhibit no stress and their attention wandered from their flight duties. Too much stress and the thinking processes seemed to stagnate, resulting in a sensory overload and subsequent mental shutdown. The causes of student stress can range from poor performance of flight maneuvers to personal issues unrelated to flying. Stress is an inevitable and necessary part of life that can add motivation and heighten an individual's response to meet a challenge. The effects of stress are cumulative and, if the student does not cope with them in an appropriate way, they can eventually add up to an intolerable burden. Performance generally increases with the onset of stress, peaks, and then falls off rapidly as stress levels exceed a person's ability to cope. At this point, a student's performance begins to decline and judgment deteriorates. Complex or unfamiliar tasks are more subject to the adverse effects of increasing stress than simple or familiar tasks. Stress falls into two broad categories: acute, short-term, and chronic, long-term. Acute stress involves an immediate threat that is perceived as danger. This is the type of stress that triggers a fight or flight response in an individual, whether the threat is real or imagined. Normally, a healthy person can cope with acute stress and prevent stress overload. However, ongoing acute stress can develop into chronic stress. Chronic stress can be defined as a level of stress that presents an intolerable burden, exceeds the ability of an individual to cope, and causes individual performance to fall sharply. Unrelenting psychological pressures, such as loneliness, financial worries, and relationship or work problems can produce a cumulative level of stress that exceeds a person's ability to cope with a situation. When stress reaches this level, performance falls off rapidly. The instructor should make the student aware that pilots experiencing this level of stress are not safe and should not exercise their airman privileges. The indicators of excessive stress often show us three types of symptoms: emotional, physical, and behavioral. Emotional symptoms may surface as overcompensation, denial, suspicion, paranoia, agitation, restlessness, or defensiveness. Physical stress can result in acute fatigue. Behavioral degradation is manifested as sensitivity to criticism, tendency to be argumentative, arrogance, and hostility. Instructors need to learn to recognize the symptoms of stress in students. There are several techniques an instructor can suggest to a student to help manage the accumulation of life stresses and prevent stress overload. For example, to help reduce stress levels, suggest the student set aside time for relaxation each day or maintain a program of physical fitness. To prevent stress overload, encourage the student to learn to manage time more effectively to avoid pressures imposed by getting behind schedule and not meeting deadlines. For a more in-depth discussion of stress and ways to deal with it, see the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, Chapter 16, Aeromedical Factors, and Chapter 17, Aeronautical Decision-Making. Use of resources to make informed decisions during flight operations. A student must be introduced to and learn how to use all the resources found inside and outside the cockpit. Since useful tools and sources of information may not always be readily apparent, an essential part of Adm training is learning to recognize these resources. The instructor must not only identify the resources, but also help the student develop the skills to evaluate whether there is time to use a particular resource and the impact its use has upon the safety of flight. Remember to point out to your students the most valuable resource or option as a helicopter pilot is the ability to land the helicopter almost anywhere. Whether at an airport or any suitable landing area along the flight path, the option to land the aircraft is almost always available. Too many fatalities have occurred when this most basic helicopter option is overlooked. A controlled landing under power is always preferable to an emergency power-off landing. It is easy to land in an open field or lot and call for fuel or maintenance rather than crash and never get the chance again to make any calls. Getting the helicopter safely on the ground allows time to process other options without endangering the crew and/or passengers. The assistance of air traffic control, ATC, may be very useful if a student becomes lost, but in an emergency situation, there may be no time available to contact ATC. Cockpit management is also a key resource for preventing a potential accident from happening. Students must learn to manage avionics, computer messages, radios, transponders, and checklists while flying safely and under all conditions, VFR, IFR, and at night. Proper management in the cockpit helps the student to organize and learn to safely multitask. Internal resources point out to the student that the person in the other seat can be an important resource even if that person has no flying experience. When appropriate, passengers can assist with tasks, such as watching for traffic or reading checklist items aloud. Emphasize to the student the importance of verbal communication. It has been established that verbal communication reinforces an activity. Touching an object while communicating further enhances the probability an activity has been accomplished. For this reason, many solo pilots read checklists out loud. When they reach a critical item, they touch the switch or control. For example, to ascertain the force trim is on, the student can read the checklist. But, if he or she touches the force trim switch during the process, the checklist action is confirmed. Explain to the student that it is necessary for a pilot to have a thorough understanding of all the equipment and systems in the aircraft being flown. Discuss with the student that a lack of aircraft systems knowledge, for example, can lead to a tragic error. For instance, if a new pilot is unaware of the mechanical differences between a direct reading gauge, wet line, versus a gauge operating from sensors, the student pilot may not associate the oil residue under the center console to a loose fitting on the affected gauge. Without full awareness and understanding of the wet line system, the student may choose to sidestep the issue, thinking it to be out of place and of no concern. The instructor's role in expanding the student's knowledge may directly lead to a correct assessment, evaluation of available options and, ultimately, a good decision. Explain to the student that it is necessary for a pilot to have a thorough understanding of all equipment and systems in the aircraft being flown. Lack of knowledge such as whether the oil pressure gauge is a direct reading or uses a sensor is the difference between making a good decision or a poor one that leads to a tragic error. Checklists are essential internal resources used to verify the aircraft instruments and systems are checked, set, and operating properly. They also ensure proper procedures are performed when there is a system malfunction or in-flight emergency. One bad habit is reading a step on the checklist and moving on without having thoroughly performed the step. Complacency with the routine can allow us to lose focus on the task at hand. The result is a failure to complete a step or to skip it entirely. Either failure may lead to aircraft damage. Additionally, students should be taught not just the step or procedure, but the reason for the step or procedure. In essence, each step involves an aircraft system or procedure. The student should be taught why the step is performed, what indications or system settings are affected, and what potential hazards may occur if the checklist is not properly used. While instructing, notice if the student is providing verbal response out of habit, or if that student is actually comprehending and performing the checks. Verbal response is commonly used under two-pilot situations. However, many pilots of single-pilot aircraft also verbalize the checks for confirmation. Another internal resource is the Pilot's Operating Handbook, POH. Instructors should be teaching the student pilot the contents of the PO, as well as interpreting and validating the information found within the PO. Stress to the student that certain emergencies require immediate action without referencing the PO or checklist. Emphasize to the student that the PO is required to be carried on board the aircraft. Is indispensable for accurate flight planning. Plays a vital role in the resolution of in-flight equipment malfunctions when time allows. Workload Management, page 1711, is also a valuable internal resource. External resources discuss with the student the role of air traffic controllers and flight service specialists, the best external resources during flight. To promote the safe, orderly flow of air traffic around airports and along flight routes, ATC provides pilots with traffic advisories, radar vectors, and assistance in emergency situations. Explain that it is the pilot's responsibility to make the flight as safe as possible, but a pilot with a problem can request assistance from ATC. For example, if a pilot needs to be given a vector, ATC assists and becomes integrated as part of the crew. Stress to the student that the services provided by ATC can not only decrease pilot workload, but also help pilots make informed in-flight decisions. Discuss the role of the Flight Service Station, FSS, Automated Flight Service Station, AFSS, with the student. Air traffic facilities that provide pilot briefing, en-route communications, and visual flight rules, VFR, search and rescue services, assist lost aircraft and aircraft. In emergency situations, relay ATC clearances, originate notices to airmen NOTAM, broadcast aviation weather and national airspace system, NAS, information, receive and process instrument flight rules, IFR, flight plans, and monitor navigational aids NAVAIDs. At selected locations, an FSS/AFSS provides on-route flight advisory service, Flight Watch, issues airport advisories, and advises customs and immigration of transporter flights. Selected FSS/AFSS in Alaska also provide transcribed weather broadcast, TWEB, recordings and take weather observations. Helicopters often operate in locations where radio reception is poor or contact with ATC is not possible. Prepare the student for this likelihood by providing scenarios in which it may be possible to use other devices or navaids to communicate. Cellular phones or satellite phones are of great benefit. Workload management: humans have a limited capacity for information. Once information flow exceeds the person's ability to mentally process the information, any additional information becomes unattended or displaces other tasks and information already being processed. Once this situation occurs, only two alternatives exist: shed the unimportant tasks or perform all tasks at a less than optimal level. Information overload for the pilot is like an overloaded electrical circuit: either the consumption is reduced or a circuit failure is experienced. Figure 17.7, teaching a student effective workload management ensures essential operations are accomplished by planning, establishing a priority for the tasks, and then placing them in a sequence that avoids work overload. As the student gains experience, he or she learns to recognize future workload requirements and can prepare for high workload periods during times of low workload. It is important for the instructor to model good workload management techniques. For example, review the appropriate chart and set radio frequencies well in advance of when they are needed to reduce workload as the flight nears the airport. In addition, listen to the Automatic Terminal Information Service, ATIS, Automated Surface Observing System, ASOS, or Automated Weather Observing System, AWOS, if available, and then monitor the tower frequency or Common Traffic Advisory Frequency, CTAF, explaining to the student that these external resources give a pilot a good idea of what traffic conditions to expect. Another tool of workload management, that complements the use of these systems, is simple navigation and landmark referencing. By planning ahead and using visual landmarks, the student learns to maintain situational awareness, and use these landmarks to prompt a necessary call or to alert the pilot of upcoming controlled or special use airspace. Remind students that checklists should be performed well in advance so there is time to focus on traffic and ATC instructions. Emphasize to the student that these procedures are especially important prior to entering a high-density traffic area, such as Class B airspace. Discuss workload management with the student. 1. Recognition of a work overload situation is an important component of managing workload. The first effect of high workload: the pilot may be working harder but accomplishing less. As workload increases, attention cannot be devoted to several tasks at one time and the pilot may begin to focus on one item. When a pilot becomes task saturated, there is no awareness of input from various sources, so decisions may be made on incomplete information, and the possibility of error increases. 2. When a work overload situation exists, a pilot needs to stop, think, slow down, and prioritize. It is important for the student to understand how to decrease workload. Encourage him or her to learn how to place a situation in the proper perspective, remain calm, and think rationally. Explain that these are the key elements in reducing stress and increasing the capacity to fly safely. Remind the student this ability depends upon experienced discipline, and the training that they are in the process of receiving. Situational awareness: many definitions of situational awareness exist. For the beginning pilot, it is most likely placing a term on a pre-existing, subconscious practice. No two individuals share exactly the same degree of situational awareness. Some people seem to be aware of almost everything that is going on around them, while others seem oblivious to anything except the single task at hand. As instructors, we try to instill safety by teaching the student situational awareness through heightening of their senses and broadening student awareness before, during, and after flight. While there are many techniques and learning tools available, one of the most commonly used is found in the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, PHAK. The FAK provides an aviation-directed tool that instructors may use for new pilots, the acronym PAVE. PAVE is composed of 4 fundamental risk elements for flight: pilot, aircraft, environment, and external pressures. Explain that situational awareness is knowing what is going on during the flight. Use the monitoring of radio communications for traffic, weather discussion, and ATC communication to demonstrate to the student how these resources enhance situational awareness by helping the pilot develop a mental picture of what is happening. Discuss with the student how maintaining situational awareness requires an understanding of the relative significance of all flight-related factors and their future impact on the flight. When a student understands what is going on and has an overview of the total operation, he or she is not fixated on one perceived significant factor. Stress that it is important not only to know the aircraft's geographical location but also to understand what is happening around it. Provide the student with scenario-based training, which enhances the student's ability to maintain situational awareness and uses all of the skills involved in admiral obstacles to maintaining situational awareness. Explain to the student that fatigue, stress, complacency, and work overload can cause a pilot to fixate on a single item perceived as important and reduce overall situational awareness of the flight. Discuss how a factor contributing to many accidents is distraction that diverts the pilot's attention from monitoring the instruments or scanning outside the aircraft. NTSB accident records offer flight instructors many examples of loss of situational awareness that can be used for training purposes. Impress upon the student how easily a minor problem, such as a gauge that is not reading correctly, can result in an accident. The pilot diverts attention to the perceived problem and neglects to properly control the aircraft. Operational pitfalls, figure 17.8, are routinely underemphasized. Instructors have the ability to influence and impact future generations of aviators through their instructional techniques and practices. While we frequently refer to the operational pitfalls as present for most aviation occupations, we fail to highlight the results of making these mistakes. The NTSB database, http://ntsb.gov/ntsb/query.asp, is one of the greatest tools available to instructors when discussing operational pitfalls with new pilots. Conducting queries of helicopter accidents and incidents provides factual, aviation-related events that can be directly associated with the specific pitfalls outlined in Figure 17.8. For instance, when discussing loss of positional or situational awareness, a query of the NTSB database presents an incident that occurred in January 2004, NTSB identification, MIA 04K048. While taxiing a helicopter for an upcoming early morning flight, the helicopter's left skid contacted a hedge bush row, causing the helicopter to roll onto its left side, dynamic rollover. Additional investigation discovered an expired biennial review. This simple, yet costly, error provides the opportunity to discuss many aviation topics. Was the accident due to lack of situational awareness or the mindset of the pilot? Perhaps there was an element of fatigue involved or a perceived sense of urgency or get-there-itis. Follow-up discussion can include dynamic rollover and biennial review requirements. This one example is likely to leave a lasting impression on a new pilot. Instructors must take advantage of resources available to them not only to discuss these topics with new students, but to instill safety awareness in the minds of new pilots. If a climate of safety awareness is achieved, perhaps we can reduce the number of or even eliminate incidents/accidents and needless fatalities in helicopters with pilots of all experience levels. While discussing each pitfall, begin with the classic behavioral traps, into which pilots have been known to fall, that lead to accidents. Talk about the tendency of pilots, particularly those with considerable experience, who always try to complete a flight as planned, please passengers, and meet schedules. Warn the student that the desire to meet these goals can have an adverse effect on safety and contribute to an unrealistic assessment of piloting skills under stressful conditions. Encourage the student to learn how to identify and eliminate these operational pitfalls. Figure 17.8. An instructor must develop the student's awareness of and teach the students how to avoid operational pitfalls by ensuring effective ADM training is given. Figure 17.9. Instructor tips. NTSB accident records offer many accident/incident reports that can be tailored to test the student's ADM knowledge. A student will attempt to imitate instructor actions. Do not take shortcuts. Instill safety from the first day. Questions or situations posed by the instructor must be open-ended, rather than requiring only rote or one-line responses. Chapter summary. This chapter provided the flight instructor with a review of ADM and SRM. It also offered recommendations on how ADM and SRM can be integrated into training.